Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Indiana Landmark Center. I'm Suzanne Stanis. I'm the Vice President of Education, and we are delighted to have all of you here. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you of a couple of things. With the weather being so nice, and it looks like it's continuing to be that way, we've got a lot of tours coming up. So check out our tours on Mass Avenue. We've got a fun one downtown called Decoding Downtown. Also got Chatham Arch, White River, and Monument Circle coming up. And then our newest tour is the Propylaeum. And then we've also got a tour of the Athenaeum. So that allows me to practice my Greek a little bit and stumble on that. So go to our calendar on indianalandmarks.org and you can check out those and other upcoming programs. So for those of you on Zoom, welcome. We will be monitoring the Q&A feature on that. So if you're on Zoom and you have a question, please type it in there and we'll answer those at the end as time permits. For those of you in the audience, we'll also allow questions, but please wait until someone reaches you with a microphone. Otherwise, the Zoom attendees will not be able to hear you. So tonight, I have the honor of welcoming Evan Finch. And it turns out that I think Evan and I have a lot in common. I hope that's we'll see if you agree with this. But at an early age, Evan Finch was fascinated by roadside attractions he would spot out the back window of family trips. Now, this was the same thing for me. I don't know if this happened to you or not, but because my brother was considerably older than I was, and I would yell out, "Let's stop at the Giant Ball of Twine or Rock City," my parents would say, "We did that with your brother, and it was a tourist trap." So I hope your parents stopped more. But now in our old age, my brother and I drive back around to these places because he was so young, he didn't remember them, and now we get to experience them together. But getting back to Evan, at a somewhat less early age, he began seeking out those attractions himself, learning their stories, and sharing his newfound knowledge with anyone who would listen. And we're glad that you're here to hear that. When not wandering the byways of Indiana, he works for CVR, an Indianapolis-based advertising, marketing, and PR agency. So please welcome Evan Finch.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. And let's just do some small talk. Hi, everybody. Hi. How was your day? Yeah, mine too. Good for you. Um, well, as some of you probably already know from the giant slide behind me, my name is Evan, and I just want to, off the bat, say thank you to Indiana Landmarks for having me, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a Wednesday night. And I don't know where the camera is, but Zoom, thank you so much for opening your laptops on a Wednesday night. Effort is effort, and that should be rewarded, so thank you. The last time I gave this talk was 11 years ago. And yeah, I know. And I can tell you right now that tonight's talk is not going to be wildly different from the talk that I gave 11 years ago, but if your memory is getting to be as patchy as mine, that might not be an issue at all. I'm counting on that, actually. At any rate, I hope I'll be able to share some Indiana curiosities that you haven't seen or don't know about yet. And all in all, I think it's going to be like taking a long car trip with me. It's going to be rambling. Going to be a lot of pointless detours, and the whole thing's going to go on a little bit longer than you want it to. Back in 2014, I started this talk with a disclaimer, and I'm going to do it again because I think it's important to note that I am not an expert. I'm not an expert on landmarks. I'm not an expert on preservation, and I'm not an expert on PowerPoint presentations, as will soon become painfully obvious to all of you. I guess what I am is just a person who goes around and looks for the unusual. There's some. And I do that for a very simple reason. It's because our world is full of, frankly, too much usual and not enough fun. And there's franchisers, there's chain stores, and it's all starting to look alike. And to illustrate my point, CVS, starting to look a lot like Walgreens. Wendy's, starting to look a lot like McDonald's. And Castleton is starting to look a lot like Avon or Greenwood. Who can tell? In general, I would say that everywhere is starting to look a little too much like everywhere else. And what I'm looking for is somewhere that I can't find anywhere else. Now, do these opinions make me an expert? No, as the slide a few slides ago told you, I am not an expert. What I am is just a dilettante. And as a dilettante, I have a very dilettantish definition of what constitutes a landmark. And I think it's really anything that carries meaning for the person who's looking at it. And when an awful lot of people have the same opinion, then it's a community landmark and it's something that binds us all together. And sometimes those kinds of landmarks can be, a historic site, the Lincoln Boyhood Home. Pardon me, I'm struggling with my notes. Without my notes, I am nothing. And sometimes it might be a old home that somebody special lived in this case, the house of Thomas Marshall, vice president. And sometimes it's just a big fiberglass guy in striped overalls coming at you with a big fiberglass cheeseburger. And that's the kind of landmark that appeals to me in particular, partly because it's fun and partly because it's just unusual. It breaks up the monotony of everyday life. Sometimes unusual landmarks are unusual because they sprang from one person's individual vision. They were unique from the get-go. And sometimes there used to be a lot of them, and then most of them faded away, and now they've become unique through attrition. So I'm attracted by both of those. And sometimes they just have an unusual story attached to them, and I like those as well. One of the benefits of being a dilettante is I don't have to be especially, persnickety about my criteria. And with that, I will stop rambling for the nonce, and we will make the first stop on our trip, which is the Big Peach down in Bruceville, Indiana, just a little bit north of Vincennes. Back in 1954, Wilbur and Doris Yates started a peach orchard. And the Yateses wanted to attract traffic to their farm. It's a little bit off the main road. So what they did was they got themselves some chicken wire and some concrete, and they built a big peach. And then they put an even bigger obelisk next to it, and that attracted attention and customers. And if anybody here happened to attend the 1939 World's Fair in New York, you may have noticed a more than passing resemblance to the Trialon and Perisphere that were at the centerpiece of that fair. Not a coincidence. The Big Peach was purchased by Carl Rogers in 1968, and it was run by the Rogers family until about 2013, when a new owner took over, and much to her credit, has changed nothing about the place. In fact, I would say that she's actually plussed up the experience a little bit because she has recognized that people love this thing. That's always such a surprise to me when the thing that started out as advertising is now the thing being advertised. And she has created the Big Peach T-shirt, which you can put on as you're eating your Big Peach pie and washing it all down with Big Peach cider. Next, we will talk about the Kreider World's Fair Gardens, which are way up in Middlebury. And some of you know where Middlebury is. For those of you who don't, it's not too far distant from Elkhart, kind of up by the Michigan state line. And in 1896, a school teacher and fruit farmer named Vernon Kreider opened a nursery there. And thanks to its wholesale operations and its mail order business, Kreider Nurseries went on to become one of Middlebury's biggest industries. It was so big, as a matter of fact, that the town's post office had to be enlarged to accommodate all the orders that Kreider's was getting. When the 1933 World's Fair came to Chicago, Kreider's saw an opportunity to advertise itself up there, so they spent $10,000 to construct an installation called Kreider's Diversified Garden, which featured a number of the plants they sold plus a few decorative structures. And that was money well spent because it got them more than 200,000 new names for their mail order business and probably made the post office tear their hair out, enlarging yet again. After the World's Fair ended, Kreider didn't want to lose all the investment they'd made in their garden, so they brought a lot of it back from Chicago to Middlebury, and they reconstructed the garden in 1935. This was not taken in 1935. It was somewhat more recent. Kreider went out of business in 1990, but the town still operates the reconstructed garden as a community park. This next site we're going to talk about has been on the National Register of Historic Places since 2002, so it is hardly an unsung attraction, but it is definitely an unusual attraction, and I am speaking of Camp Chesterfield. It's a Thank you. A 139-year-old spiritualist camp that sits in the town of Chesterfield, just outside Anderson. And spiritualism, for the uninitiated, is a belief that the living can still speak to the spirits of the dead if you find a translator, essentially, a spirit medium. And the belief became very popular in the 1800s, and especially so in the years after the Civil War, when hundreds of thousands of young men had died and their families still wanted to get in touch with them. So spiritualist camps popped up all over the United States. And as the 20th century kind of, wore on, the belief kind of started to lose followers and the spiritualist camps closed, except in Chesterfield, where it is still open, and it's been open like all these years since 1886. It's essentially a community of mediums and clairvoyants. So you can go to these folks and put your money down and you can get a reading. But I've never done that, tempting though it is. But there are all kinds of things to see in Chesterfield, even if you don't get a reading. There is a huge mall in the middle of the camp, and there's many different things there. These structures are basically just outdoor tables, referred to as toadstools. And I believe this is where the mediums used to sit outdoors in good weather and give readings to their customers. There is, oh my goodness, this is the Trail of Religion, and I have to check my notes because I always forget who sculpted this. It was a man named Ivan Adams from Bloomington who sculpted it in 1943. And there's busts of history's great thinkers. There's Muhammad and Osiris and Jesus, and notably, there's Zoroaster, who we'll come back to later. There's also an American Indian memorial, which was commissioned from the spirit world in 1940 by an Illinois farmer who had passed away 28 years earlier, but had a lot of opinions in the afterlife, and one of them was that they should erect this giant Indian in Chesterfield. There are various other structures on the grounds. There is a well-appointed bookstore where you can buy mediums, postcards of past mediums. They must have printed up tons and tons of these, which gives you an idea of how popular they must have been to like just get all these postcards printed up of them. And I'm delighted that they still sell them. And I have brought these, home to my wife many a time. And she goes, "Oh, more? Great. I'll just." But as far as I'm concerned, the coolest building in the camp is the art gallery and museum. And this building is divided into two halves. One half, as you might have already guessed, is the art gallery. And this is full of what they call precipitated spirit portraits. And these are ostensibly created by spirits. This particular painting shows George Washington Carver, and St. George hanging out in the afterlife. And why not? And so the art gallery is cool in and of itself, but what I was really attracted to was the museum on the other side of the building. And the museum is somewhat a history of spiritualism in general, but it's very specifically a history of Camp Chesterfield. And you kind of have to make an appointment to get in. Somebody has to go over and unlock the doors and let you in. But from there on, it's a lot of fun. They have old chalkboards that spirits used to write messages on during seances. They have a collection of these old, horns that spirits would speak through in seances, the Eccles standard trumpet luminous rings. And they've got very interesting photos of mediums in trance exuding ectoplasm from various orifices. I think I see William Howard Taft in the middle of that hunk of ectoplasm. But yeah, a great place, and this honestly seems like as good as any of a time to take a detour, because part of any good road trip is like stopping to eat, and Indiana has some great places to stop and eat. And I don't want to represent myself as a gourmet because I am certainly not, and I'm no more a gourmet than I am a preservation expert. When I stop at a restaurant, I generally do it because of the way it looks, or because it has an unusual specialty, or several, or because it's got a long history. And sometimes, if I'm lucky, I'll find a place that has all three of those things, such as the Hilltop Inn down in Evansville. The Hilltop Inn is housed in an 1839 building that was originally used as a stagecoach stop, but its more unique claim to fame is their fried brain sandwich. And these days, they're really hanging their hat on the fried brains, and in 2009, that earned it the title of the manliest restaurant in America, which confused me because I never thought it was particularly manly to eat a brain. It seemed like more of a zombie thing. But if you are a manly zombie, the Hilltop Inn has your number. Along with the jumbo brain sandwich, they also offer pork brain sliders for the manly zombie watching his waistline, as well as fried chicken gizzards, and something called pork grenades, which sounds lethal and explosive, and proceed at your own risk there. Another restaurant with an unusual claim to fame is Nick's Kitchen in Huntington, Indiana. Indiana doesn't have a state sandwich yet, but when we do, it's pretty obviously going to be the fried pork tenderloin. Yes, thank you. Let's hear it for the tenderloin. And Nick's Kitchen at Huntington claims that its founder, Nick Feinstein, was the person who invented the modern tenderloin in 1904. There is also a grisly origin story that comes on the side with this tenderloin, and I debated or not whether to tell this, but we're getting closer to Halloween, so why not? Nick's brother, Jake, took a ill-advised sleigh ride on the coldest night of the year and suffered a terrible frostbite and had to have all of his fingers amputated, which made it very hard for him to find work. So his brother put him to work in the kitchen, pounding the tenderloins to tenderize them. So that's sort of like a very macabre secret sauce. And the only reason I know this story is because Nick's used to put it on the menu at the restaurants. At this point, I think that cooler heads may have prevailed, realized that's not necessarily the most appetite-inducing thing to put on the menu, but you heard it here. I'm keeping the flame. Nick's is located just down the road from another landmark destination, and many of you will know that Huntington is the home, or was the home at least, of Dan Quayle, who was vice president under George Bush, the first one. And Huntington is now home to a Dan Quayle Center, and that center is home to the United States Vice Presidential Museum, more officially known these days as the Quayle Vice Presidential Learning Center. And it was, well as various different artifacts related directly to Dan Quayle, such as this bedazzled egg that portrays his swearing-in ceremony. The museum includes biographical information on every single vice president, and some of it is fascinating. 6 of them were from Indiana. You probably knew that. But I was especially impressed to learn that Charles Dawes, who was vice president under Calvin Coolidge, had co-authored a #1 pop song. Which is incredible, and doubly incredible because he did that 7 years after dying. And back to Camp Chesterfield. I'm not going to stop and tell that story now, but if either you or I remembers after the talk, I will try to explain the origin of that. Small museums in general are great spots to visit, and Indiana has some wonderful ones. And I'm about to talk about one that's very close to us up in Zionsville. And up there, there's a company called Fanimation, and they have created a fan museum officially sanctioned by the American Fan Collectors Association. And this museum has, as one might expect, fans of all kinds. They have desk fans, they have ceiling fans, they have plenty of hand fans. They have fans that look like cats. They have a celebrity fan that once appeared on an episode of Perry Mason. And I would guess it probably never stops telling that story to all the other fans up there. And you can look at this collection all you want, but I should warn you that you can't check anything out because, contrary to what you might expect, the collection does not circulate. Thanks. We'll move on. We'll move on down to Mitchell, Indiana, which was childhood home of Gus Grissom, the astronaut, and is currently home to the Gus Grissom Memorial Museum. Gus Grissom, as I mentioned, was born in Mitchell, and he grew up to be one of the original astronauts selected for the Mercury program. And the museum inside Spring Mill State Park has a really very impressive collection of artifacts from Gus Grissom's life. It's got everything from the slide rule that he used when he was at Purdue to the actual Gemini 3 space capsule. It's really a really incredible collection, but what really drew my attention was this, and you can kind of see it in the back. And if you think, is that a sandwich embedded in a block of lucite? Then you're absolutely right. Yes, it is. What this is, it's a replica of the first corned beef sandwich to orbit the Earth. When the Gemini 3 launched on March 23rd, 1965, the astronauts, who were new to the astronaut biz, they were not fans of the dehydrated meals that NASA was giving them. So Grissom's fellow astronaut, a fellow named John Young, went to a delicatessen, got a corned beef sandwich, put it in the pocket of his spacesuit, waited until about halfway through the mission, and then kind of pulled it out of his pants and offered it to Gus Grissom, said, "Hey, Skipper, want a bite?" And Gus Grissom was, I think, initially confused, then amused, and then concerned because he noticed that crumbs were starting to free float around the cabin and get close to the instruments that were going to get them back to Earth. So I think Gus Grissom said, "Good one," and put it in his pocket, zipped it up so there would be no further debris flying out. And they got back to Earth okay, and then there was a big to-do. There was a congressional hearing, and a NASA leader had to go in front of Congress and reassure legislators that steps had been taken to prevent recurrence of corned beef sandwiches in future flights. So bad news for you, corned beef. You might think that the guy who carried the corned beef sandwich on the flight would get in trouble. Maybe he got a stern talking to, but it did not slow him down because John Young went on to have a really fabulous career at NASA. He went back to space 5 more times. He even walked on the moon during the Apollo 16 mission. And also corned beef, too, did eventually return to space. So there's a happy ending to this. In 1981, the Space Shuttle Columbia was launched. And this time, on its 2-day mission, astronauts were able to enjoy, this time, NASA-approved corned beef on their flight, which was commanded, not entirely coincidentally, by the same John Young who had smuggled that first sandwich onto Gemini 3. The guy knew what he liked. And now, making a smooth transition from corned beef sandwiches to apples, we'll talk about Johnny Appleseed. There he is. Johnny Appleseed, I would say, occupies the same part of most people's minds as Paul Bunyan or John Henry, such a legendary character that you're not quite sure whether he was a real person or not. And even some of the people who know he was real are surprised to learn that he is buried up near, well, in Fort Wayne. John Chapman was born in Massachusetts in 1774, and he did indeed spend much of his life walking around the country planting apple seedlings. And what he would do would be to push out a little bit ahead of the expansion of white settlers, and he would plant an apple orchard. And by the time there were actually settlers in the area, there would be like trees big enough to sell to them. So Johnny was not just an eccentric who liked apples, he was also a bit of a capitalist. So the fruit of these trees, incidentally, would be less often eaten and more often drunk as hard cider. There is a statistic that I read in a biography of Johnny Appleseed that said the average hard cider consumption of an adult in Ohio in the early 1800s was about 30 gallons a year. So you can remember that for your next trivia night. Over his 70 years, John Chapman spent most of his life sleeping outside, but sometimes in bad weather, he would sleep inside in the home of whoever happened to be nearby and feeling generous. And one night in March of 1845, he was staying in the cabin of a man named William Worth, who lived in Fort Wayne near the St. Joseph River, and he died there in his sleep. And they buried him, and about 25 years after that, there was an article in the Fort Wayne Sentinel in which the writer made reference to a knoll in Fort Wayne where Johnny Appleseed was buried. And in 1916, even a little bit later, the Indiana Horticultural Society picked a spot on that knoll, and they set up a fence and a plaque. So it's an approximate location, but Johnny Appleseed really is buried somewhere around there. And Fort Wayne honors him with a Johnny Appleseed Festival every September, which incidentally will be celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. So if you have idle time on your hands, September 20th, head on up. Plus, the city now has a minor league baseball team called the Tin Caps, whose mascot is this very determined looking apple wearing just what you'd expect on top of its stem, as well as honoring real people who seem legendary. Indiana also honors a few celebrities who are purely imaginary, such as Joe Palooka. Joe Palooka was a comic strip character created in 1921, and his strip ran all the way up until 1984. And in his day, he was pretty popular. Popular enough, in fact, for a couple of Bedford stone carvers named Harry Easton and George Hitchcock to make a statue of him in the 1940s. And their statue ended up being 10 feet tall, so he is indeed a big Palooka. The statue was dedicated in Bedford on June 15th, 1948, and it was even worked into the comic strip on September 5th of that year. Unfortunately, back in Bedford, Joe kept getting vandalized by locals, which might be an occupational risk when you're a statue of a boxer. But people just kept hitting him, wouldn't leave him alone, and Bedford kept moving him around town, hoping people would kind of lose track of him. But it didn't work, so eventually in 1984, they moved him all the way out of Bedford to the nearby town of Olytic, where he has stood unscathed for the last 41 years. This, incidentally, was not Bedford's last experience sculpting a ginormous comic book character. In 1949, the town of Idaho Springs, Colorado, commissioned the Indiana Limestone Company to carve a giant statue of Colonel Steve Canyon, who some of you might remember. It's also still standing and probably confusing anybody who lives in Idaho Springs who's younger than 60. It would be hard to find a more impressive landmark than the hub of the universe, and it turns out that that hub is located right here in Indiana, up in Benton County, about 15 minutes south of Fowler. And you can tell it's the hub of the universe because they tell you so. It's right there on the town water tower. You might think this is small town hubris, but there's actually a reasonable explanation for this. Back in the 1930s, the principal of Boswell High School was a man named Edgar Burnett. And he had a habit of addressing students on their first day of classes and telling them that Boswell was the hub of the universe, in the sense that spokes radiated out every which way from Boswell. And once you get out of high school, you could get onto one of those spokes, follow it out to somewhere else, and do anything you wanted to do. Which actually is a pretty inspirational story. And Boswell does have at least one more claim to fame. Its racetrack was where Dan Patch, the famous racehorse, made his debut back in 1900. There are plenty of other famous animals in Indiana too. Maybe not as famous as Dan Patch, but considerably weirder. And one of those animals is Stiffy Green. Everybody know Stiffy Green? He's plucky. He's the ghostly bulldog of Vigo County. He originally hung out at the Heinel family mausoleum in Terre Haute's Highland Park Cemetery, and a legend has it that he was John Heinel's beloved pet, and he kind of pined away when John died, and so that when the dog died, they had him stuffed and put it in John's mausoleum. And over time, this became local legend. And it became kind of a rite of passage for local teens in the area to creep up through the cemetery in the middle of the night and shine flashlights through the gate of the mausoleum and shine them on Stiffy, and Stiffy's green eyes would reflect back at them. Which is, good fun. By the 1980s, however, teens had progressed from shining flashlights on Stiffy to shooting bullets at him. I know, we can't have nice things. So Stiffy, who is in fact, I'm not gonna, don't tell anybody I told you this, but he's actually made of plaster. So the family said, enough of this. They took him out of the mausoleum and they donated him to the Vigo County Museum, where he has a cozy replica mausoleum, living the quiet life. You can go and visit him in Vigo County anytime you'd like. And as long as we're talking about the supernatural, we might as well touch on the Willard Library down in Evansville. The Willard Library is beautiful, as you can see here. It doesn't look any different today. It's one of those buildings that is a bona fide official landmark in the Gothic Revival style, finished construction in 1885. What makes it more than just a really beautiful building is that it's supposed to be haunted by a ghost they refer to as the Gray Lady, who is said to appear from time to time in the basement down by the children's library, which just seems mean. Um, but the library has embraced this, and it's the only Indiana library that I'm aware of that actually has ghost cams on its library website. So, yeah, Colin, you might remember I like pointed you. Yes, the other night I was on the ghost cam at the public library in Willard, as one does, and the only thing I could see at night was like a hamster running on a treadmill. So I sent it to Colin hoping he would see something more spectral than I did, but we saw something. Um, Sticking with the theme of the afterlife, we will move up to Kokomo and visit Old Ben. Old Ben, as many of you will know, is a big stuffed steer that's on display at Highland Park. He's actually enclosed these days, probably because too many kids were reaching up like this and grabbing his nose. Ben was born in 1902 on the Murphy Farm near Bunker Hill in Miami County. He weighed 125 pounds at birth when he was young Ben, and he had reached 2 tons by the time he was 4 years old. And in his lifetime, he was quite a celebrity. He even had his own railroad, sort of. The nickel plates ran a special line out to his farm so he could get on a car more easily and travel around the state and make personal appearances. And after he died in 1910, his hide was stuffed, and by 1919, he was on display in Kokomo, and arguably, he's gone on to become an even bigger celebrity dead than he was when he was alive. And Old Ben's neighbor in Highland Park is another oversized deceased celebrity, which is a giant sycamore stump. And this stump is all that remains of a tree that stood on the west end of Howard County near New London before a big storm took it down. It was moved to Highland Park in 1916, and subsequently the National Youth Administration built a nice little shelter for it in the 1930s. This is, by the way, not the only giant sycamore stump in the state. It has a rival in Greene County at the Worthington City Park. And here's a picture of my old dog Rosie being not as impressed with it as I thought she should have been. Anyway, just as Indiana has 2 giant sycamore chunks, we also have 2 pink elephants. And here's one of them now, yes, standing outside the Elite Beverages liquor store in Fortville. Now, as I was telling you before this started, the elephant's past is a little bit shrouded in mystery because the first time I could find mention of it in Fortville was in 1976 when there was a man named Paul Dyer who had gotten a permit to tow the elephant in the Fortville Town Parade around the 4th of July. But when it wasn't in parades, it was standing outside the Wagon Wheel, Paul Dyer's liquor store. And you wouldn't think that having the big delirium tremens outside the front door would encourage drinkers, but apparently it did because the elephant has become really a beloved character there in Fortville. And when also, side detour again, the elephant's original name was Talmadge, which is just a strange name for anything, let alone an elephant, but its original name was Talmadge. And when the Wagon Wheel was sold to Elite Beverages in 2006, the elephant stayed with the property. And these days, it's been renamed. There's the picture of the old elephant from the air back when apparently doing business out of a barn in those days. These days, its name is Elatini, and I'm sorry, I've gotten off track with my clicking as I knew I would. But Elatini is being like thoroughly merchandised now by Elite Beverages. You can walk in there and get the pink elephant on a T-shirt or a shot glass or a martini glass or a koozie or whatever like floats your boat. And because you never hear about anybody seeing only one pink elephant, Indiana has a second one just 3.5 hours away at the Jim Hip Nursery in Hobstadt, Indiana. Hobstadt's pink elephant is a little more vibrant than the one in Fortville, and apparently has better vision, or at least contacts, possibly. And seems to be a family man, although it seems like everybody's trying to notice Daddy's little problem, but even elephants don't like to talk about the elephant in the room. Thanks for your sympathy. I appreciate it. Another big animal landmark in Indiana, which may make some of you nostalgic, is the cougar that used to sit on top of Crossroads Lincoln Mercury on the south side of Indianapolis. The Cougar was placed there in 1974, and it took a little more than a year for somebody to shoot it with a hunting arrow. Because again, we can't have nice things. Um, these days, the Cougar is happily retired and it's living a quiet life on the athletic fields at Greenfield Central High School in Greenfield, Indiana. But that is just the tip of the iceberg because the fiberglass gods have been more than good to Indiana. Muffler man. Muffler man is a term that's been coined to describe the giant molded fiberglass figures that began to appear in the early 1960s. And they were often made to promote businesses, and so many of them were used to promote muffler shops that they've become to be known collectively as muffler men. Pardon me while I drink. Here's to you, muffler man. Anyone who's ever driven west of White River on 16th Street has passed by a muffler man who's still on the job after 60 years, and I'm speaking, of course, of Mr. Bendo. According to an old interview with the shop's owner, Ralph Potter, Mr. Bendo, who actually is one of several Mr. Bendos across the nation, was acquired in the mid-1960s, and he was named after a device called the Huth, one of those, tube bender, which was used to bend tubes into mufflers and exhaust pipes. But is Mr. Bendo the only muffler man in Indiana? Heavens no, and here's where we start to get into Muncie, and you're going to be seeing Muncie a lot. Just outside Yorktown is a fellow who looks like he could be Mr. Bendo's clean-shaven cousin. And these days he is standing outside McAllister Rentals, somewhat empty-handed. But at his last job, he was promoting Jack Smith Motors at 18th and Madison in Muncie. In fact, he had been in that lot long before Jack Smith got there. When the same location was known as Madison Street Motors in the 1960s, the muffler man was known as the Big Man for reasons which are probably evident. And even before then, he was affiliated with Paul Nottingham's Chrysler Plymouth dealership and offering giant savings on the very same lot. It's one of the things I like about muffler men is they switch jobs so often, but always employable. Let's take this guy, for instance. These days, he is hanging out in front of Richard's Discount Store in the improbably named town of Toto, Indiana. But before that, he was luring in customers at the Enchanted Forest, which was an amusement park in Porter, Indiana, that operated between 1957 and 1991. It was known as the Playground of the Indiana Dunes. But this character here has an even more complicated backstory. He seems to have been originally manufactured for Dave Waite Pontiac, the chief Pontiac dealer of the Midwest, whose car dealership was located near 54th and Keystone in Indianapolis. But in 1971, Dave Waite decided it was time to donate the statue to the Museum of Indian Heritage, which some of you may or may not remember. It was inside Eagle Creek Park. And that museum later merged with / was absorbed by the Idolzorg. But even before then, the statue was on the move yet again. It ended up in the town of Montpelier to honor the area's historic collection to the Miami tribe. And as many of you probably already know, this statue enjoyed some national fame in the 2000s when it was featured in the opening credits for the TV show Parks and Recreation. Another giant who appeared in those same Parks and Rec credits was this guy. His name is Corey. I'm not sure why. I have not seen him in a while, but hopefully he is still standing at the intersection of State Roads 18 and 3 in Blackford County. Originally, Corey lived in Connorsville, just outside a Marathon station that was converted to a Flagman gas station and eventually converted to a closed gas station. And that's when he moved again to Muncie. He went to Muncie, he got a new pair of white pants, and he shilled for Pam Reason Auto Sales until about 2005. He was then moved to what I'm pretty sure is still his current location, standing outside the Tin Lizzy ice cream shop in the Covered Bridge Gallery of Fine Gifts near Hartford City. And when I dropped by in 2019, both of those businesses looked like they had been closed for some time, which accounts for the shabby appearance of Corey's jacket. I hope he gets a new gig really soon. Now, most of these muffler men were produced by places like International Fiberglass in Venice, California, or Fast Fiberglass in Sparta, Wisconsin. But Indiana did have its own homegrown source of fiberglass structures, and that source was an artist and educator in Delaware County by the name of Richard Kishel. And Richard Kishel was a really impressive character. Um, when he wasn't teaching at the Burris Laboratory School in Muncie, he had a business called Art Forms, and he kept himself very busy when he wasn't in school, creating landmark sculptures out of fiberglass. Art Forms started off by making playground equipment, including, well, this concrete turtle, which I visited just last month at Westside Park in Muncie. It's been on the job for a long time. But Mr. Kishel went on to create a whole lot of other sculptures as well, and many of them are still around today. But at this point, you've probably stopped listening to me because you've gotten distracted by the big picture of the Frankenstein monster with a hot dog in one hand and a mug of beer in the other. And here's a better look at the finished product. I have a friend from high school who swears to me that we once took a road trip specifically to see this, and it's one of the real regrets of my life that I don't remember it. You would think I would remember seeing this, but I got nothing. I wish I could tell you this was still around today, but it is not. Frankenstein, and incidentally, I love the faces on these fast food workers. Because this is the face of every high school student that has ever worked a fast food job. I'm sorry to report that it was on the Dunes Highway from the 1960s until the 1980s, and then in the 1980s, after the business closed, the statue was destroyed. But I have better news about that big lumberjack that you saw in the photo a few slides ago. That lumberjack was made in 1965 for the Kirby Wood Lumber Company up in Muncie. And Kirby Wood closed after a fire in the 1980s. Fortunately, the lumberjack stayed put and became sort of the adopted property of the hardware store next door, McCarty on the Point Hardware. And after the hardware store closed, the lumberjack got a new shirt and was moved to the intersection of Tillotson and Kilgore, where he now stands outside the Timbers Lounge. Dick Kishel in Art Forms also created a character named Mr. 15 for a fast food chain that started in Muncie back when you could sell a hamburger for 15 cents and name your restaurant after it. That obviously didn't last. So after you could no longer sell a hamburger for 15 cents and call your restaurant Mr. 15, the chain was renamed Burger Man, and away we go to Burger Man. So it limped along for a little while into the mid-70s, and by that point, Burger Man disappeared. But there is still at least one Burger Man statue that hangs out in the small town of Shirley, Indiana, outside of a liquor store. They took away his hamburger, they gave him a nondescript beer can, and put a light on his head, but he's still there. And the day I was there, obviously, it was karaoke night and Kevin's birthday. There are several other Dick Kishel creations still roaming around Indiana. He has left quite a legacy. There is this Uncle Sam at Uncle Sam's Car Wash down in Vincennes. And there is also this hobo, which was originally created for Armand's restaurant and which stood outside the Rubens restaurant in Lake Station, Indiana until just last month. It was taken down. The owners complained it was taking up parking spaces, so apparently it's headed to an auction house. So keep your eyes open and bid accordingly, and this hobo could be yours. What Dick Kishel might be best known for around Indianapolis are his contributions to the original Indianapolis Zoo at Washington Park, which opened in 1964, and most notably the big white whale that sat at the edge of the park's pond. And when the zoo moved to White River State Park in 1980, they decided not to take it with them. Part of it, I think, was probably it was kind of cumbersome to move. And part of it, I think, was from a day when, they started as kind of a children's zoo. And now that they were kind of a grown-up zoo, they decided to leave the whale behind. So they sold it. And they allegedly, the whale spent some time at a water park here in town called Boogie Mountain. And then it was sold again to the Fun Spot Amusement Park in Angola. And after the Fun Spot closed, the city of Rushville bought the whale, and it briefly ended up somehow on a miniature golf course at the Indianapolis Museum of Art before it changed hands again. Because in 2018, the city of Kokomo had purchased the whale from Rushville, and they hired an artist named Justin Olson to restore it, which he did in Indianapolis at a spot near 54th and Keystone. And once he was done rehabbing it, the whale moved to Foster Park in Kokomo, where it's resting comfortably today on the banks of Wildcat Creek. I think we've proven by now that Indiana has a lot of big things. Big elephants, big steers, big stumps, big muffler men, big whales, and big praying mantises. Back in 2012, artist Scott Pitcher created Coco Mantis, a 17-foot-high praying mantis made from scrap metal that has perched at the corner of Kokomo's Washington and Sycamore Streets for, gosh, how long has that been now? 2025 minus 2012, you do the math. And roughly 1 hour north of Kokomo up in Mentone, Indiana, you will find this giant egg. Mentone, Indiana is the egg basket of the Midwest, as you can see from the egg. And they, since time began, have held an egg festival every June. And in 1946, they built this 10-foot tall egg to advertise the festival. They put it on a truck and they took it to Warsaw and they rolled it out onto the lawn of the Kosciuszko County Courthouse to advertise the egg festival. And it was a big hit. And after the festival was over, Warsaw called and said, "Hey, Mentone, come get your egg." So Mentone came and got the egg. Weren't sure what to do with it, so they just set it up in town at the corner of Main and Morgan Streets, where it stood ever since then. And it's a very good egg, just as this is a very good leg. And I've saved the smutty portion of this talk for last because I hopefully you're warmed up now and you'll accept this next story. Alois Knapp was an Austrian native who emigrated to America in 1911, and he eventually became a lawyer in Chicago. And he bought an old farm near Roselawn, Indiana. And in 1933, he and his wife happened to see a movie called This Nude World. And that was honestly, it seems to have been a real life changer for Alois because he left the movie and he went home and he had the idea to turn his farm into a nudist camp. That's him having the idea right there. And so he did, and he created the Zorro Nature Park in July 1933 after honorary Hoosier Zoroaster, who you'll no doubt remember from Chesterfield. And the Zorro Nature Park was a pretty peaceful place for 30 years. It was just nude people doing nude stuff quietly until about 1967, when Alois was getting on in years. And he decided to sell the resort to a guy named Dick Drost, who, as it turned out, had a real flair for the sleazy. And he promised Alois he would change nothing, and he took ownership, and the first thing he did was rename the place Naked City. And I believe put up billboards and just not popular with the neighbors. And the second thing he did was to put the 63-foot leg in the middle of Naked City. Which aside from being a unique sculpture is also a sundial, which I suppose, and I guess if you're a purist about being nude, you're not going to wear a watch, so you'll need some way to tell time. Naked City called it quits in 1986, when the owner was exiled from the state of Indiana. Which I didn't know that was a thing you could do, but apparently he might have been the first one. So they got him out, and the resort was repurchased and has gone back to being a quiet place called Sonora, and it's still doing business up there today. Next, we'll head to Elkhart, Indiana for something less smutty but equally sordid, and that's a lovable little monstrosity called the Elkhart Tooth Brick. Yeah. Dr. Joseph Stamp was born in 1890, and he practiced dentistry in Elkhart for well over 50 years, which is a long, long time. And in that time, he pulled a lot of teeth. And you never really think about what happens to your teeth after the doctor pulls them. In this case, the doctor took them home. He saved them, and we had enough teeth. He mixed them with concrete to create this. He created this big brick made of concrete and teeth, and he put it outside of his dental office at the corner of Lexington and Riverside. After Dr. Stamp passed away in 1987, his tooth brick was moved to a museum in town called Time Was. Unfortunately, that museum has now closed, so the fate of the tooth brick was kind of uncertain for a while, but fortunately for all of us, the tooth brick has landed safely, and these days it is now resting comfortably at an antique mall at 820 North Ward Street in Elkhart. And once you make your rounds of the 820 Antique Mall's booths, you can swing by the restrooms. You can visit the tooth block up close and personal. You can sign its guest book and head for home with a renewed commitment to flossing. And the very last landmark we'll talk about tonight is the world's largest ball of paint, which is located in Alexandria, Indiana. And this particular attraction got its start in 1997 when Michael Carmichael's son painted a baseball blue, and then they just kept going with it. They kept adding layers, and many, many thousands of paint layers have been added since then, and what started as a colorful baseball has now become a ginormous paintball that weighs over 10,000 pounds and has its own home out in the garage. When you visit the ball, which, call ahead and they'd love to have you, you'll be invited to grab a paint roller. You can choose a color of paint and you will add your own layer, making it even bigger. And once you're done, you will leave with a certificate acknowledging your achievement. And in my case, you will leave with nagging doubts about whether you could have chosen a better paint color. There are, of course, many other unusual things to see in Indiana. Oops, I went past it. There's the fragile bulldog of lapel. My picture, please do take. Don't sit on me, my back will break. There is the gigantic shoe that sits in Newcastle, and there's a small mixed breed dog for scale. And there is the mini minivan of Mitchell. But we can't talk about all of these. We're almost out of time, and if I had a book, now is the time that I would try to sell you my book. Fortunately for you, I don't have a book, but that is not going to stop me from trying to sell you other people's books, so let's talk about those. There are a few of them. One is Oddball Indiana, written by Jerome Poland. There is a similar book called Weird Indiana, written by a fellow named Mark Merriman, and there is at least one more written by Dick Woolsey titled Indiana Curiosities. And honestly, I'm not certain those books are still in print, but I did check before I left the house to make sure you can still get them online, and you can. They're used, they're affordable. Why not buy the set and give them to friends for Christmas? And according to that old clock on the iPhone, it's about time for me to wrap up. So I guess it's time to get reflective and think, what have we learned here tonight? I think one of the things we've learned is that Indiana landmarks need a much tighter system of quality control for who they let get up here and spout nonsense. And I think the other thing we've learned is that Indiana really has a surprising number of places that make us different. And I think anything that makes any place or anyone different is worth seeing, and it's appreciating, and it's worth preserving. And with that, it's probably time for us to go home and rest up for whatever Thursday has in store for us. So I'm going to put up a relevant slide of a motel on US 31 and stop yammering so that you can ask me any questions, tell me what landmarks I missed, or correct any mistakes I made when trying to pronounce the names of small towns in Indiana. All right, I'll open the floor. Oh, you. You really are too kind. And those of you on Zoom, feel free to ask questions. Just type those in. I'll be happy to field anything. And I'd be also happy to break the ice because I just remembered I was going to tell you the story about the vice president who wrote the #1 pop hit. It's All in the Game was the pop hit in question, and it was a big hit, #1 on the Billboard charts in 1958. And here's how that happened. In 1911, Charles Dawes, who was far from being a vice president, but he was just, a lawyer, I believe, and also an amateur musician, a bit of a songwriter. So he wrote an instrumental called Melody in A minor. A major, pardon me, big difference. And actually, the sheet music sold pretty well. It caught on and it was recorded by several artists before Dawes became vice president in 1925. And there's an anecdote that people used to play it every time he would walk into a room and he just really got sick of it. But 40 years later, in 1951, right after Charles Dawes died, there was a songwriter named Carl Sigman who had a set of words and he was looking for a tune to put them to, and Melody in A major occurred to him. So he put his words to the tune by the vice president. And it was recorded a little bit in the early 50s without, making much of a splash. But then in 1958, they did a version by Tommy Edwards, and that was the one that hit #1 on the Billboard charts. So that's the story of the vice president who was #1 on the Billboard pop charts. Any questions that aren't my own? Yes, Sally. Oh, well, I can hear you from here. I'll repeat the question. All right. Yes. 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 Zoomers, what Sally in the front row asks is the world's largest ball of paint certified the largest ball of paint according to Guinness World Records? I don't know, but since you've got your computers open already, maybe you could quickly Google that and get back to us. I would assume it is. I mean, they really, I mean, world's largest is a pretty bold claim. I would assume somebody has called them on that by now. But it just keeps getting bigger. That's the magic of the world's largest ball of paint. Yes.
I was just curious, where is the Land of Nod Motel? You said on 31?
Oh, the Land of Nod Motel. Yes, it's still there. It is still open. I know it is on 31 South. It is on the way to Franklin, I believe, between here and Franklin. It's a lovely sign, not as lovely as the motel on the other side of the street, the Wishing Well, which when its neon is all repaired and going, it's a beautiful sign. Yes. It was my pleasure. And I have a funny story that almost ended my marriage. One time, my wife and I were out driving, and I wanted to show her where Dan Patch was buried. And so, in the middle of a thunderstorm, we went out to where I believe Dan Patch was married. And I think that might have been the last time she went on a trip with me.
I'll ask a question. Hello.
Oh,
Hi. Hi, Evan.
Oh, hi, Rachel. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
First chance you get, you're going to get in your car. What's the next landmark you're going to and why?
Oh my goodness. I had a good answer to this. Honestly, it's probably going to be a restaurant because these days I'm a little more food motivated than I am by a big fiberglass thing motivated. And I passed a South Bend pizza place that looked really interesting called Barnaby's. And I did a little bit of, investigation. And apparently it's like really a beloved landmark around South Bend. And I feel like I need to go up and take advantage of that. And if anybody on Zoom knows another restaurant up in South Bend or another attraction I should go to, I'd be happy to go to. Yes. What was the question? I'm sorry. Mulberry? Okay. Oh, okay. Another place in Middlebury that I love until death is the Village Inn. And I know that they're famous for like the kind of smorgasbord up there, but the Village Inn, which I think my friend Dale hit me to, has some of the best pies I've ever had in my life. But I will absolutely go to Yups. Thank you.
Evan, we had a question from Zoom.
Yes, Zoom. Hello, hi.
the Zoom. Yeah, have you ever visited the Jug Rock in Shoals?
I have visited this Jug Rock in Shoals, and my gosh, one of my favorite things about the Jug Rock in Shoals is that the local high school made the Jug Rock their mascot. So you used to be able to buy a T-shirt of the Jug Rock wearing a basketball jersey, which I found just delightful. It's about the last thing in the world you think would, be able to fit a basketball jersey onto it, but they seem to be making it work. Yes, I love the Jug Rock. Yes. Hello, Liz. Yeah.
Dream meal of Indiana favorites. Give us like an entree, a beverage, and a dessert.
Well, the first thing I'd do is I'd have you talk to my friend Dale Lawrence because he is a much better person to ask than me. I only have one taste bud, and even that one doesn't work very well. But gosh, dream meal. Let's start with dessert. When I was in Anderson, just recently, I stopped by Fraser's Ice Cream in Anderson, and I think that is no offense to Yups, I'm sure it's great, but Fraser's in Anderson, just a beautiful looking place. It's kind of like, pink and green, and I can't imagine they've changed any signage since the place opened, but the ice cream's great. It's just a nice atmosphere to eat it in. If I'm eating a burger, I'm sorry, you didn't say which meal, but I interpreted meal to mean burger because that's kind of my default choice. Um, Gosh, I don't know, but now I'm going to stand up here and think about it for a long time. What is that one in Bloomington? There's a restaurant by the same name that's down in Madison, but they're not affiliated. Yeah, Hinkles. I go to Hinkles just because I like to say Hinkles. Um, and honestly, I'll have to email you about that later. Sorry. My beverage? Well, again, just because it's fresh in my mind, I like the root beer at Jean's Root Beer in Anderson. Anderson's a nice place to, get a few things knocked out. They've also got at the Lemon Drop a really good onion burger. So yeah, yeah. So you could probably take care of all your dietary needs right there in Anderson, which also has a Big Boy. I stopped by there a couple weekends ago. So yeah, all kinds of great reasons to go to Anderson. Yes.
I'm disappointed in the lack of inclusion of Perfection Fairfax,
Ooh,
the
tell me about
mighty bull that was associated with the only governor of Indiana to go to jail.
Perfection Fairfax. Who was the only Indiana governor to go to jail?
He was Thomas. He was during the Klan era, and he was put in prison for mail fraud for mailing sperm from his bull across state lines. You need to find Perfection Fairfax.
That's my next destination, Rachel. That's where I'm going next. It's like,
There is a statue to the bull, and you'll be impressed, I'm sure.
well, Perfection Fairfax or bust. I'm going. Thank you. What a name. That's beautiful. Yes, Mindy, hi.
White beard. What happened to that beautiful white beard that you had in your promotion?
That's a fair question. Let's take a look at that beard again. There it is. Honestly, it comes and goes. I've come to consider that kind of my winter plumage, that I will grow it in winter months. I'll kind of blend into the snowy landscape and evade predators that way. It'll be back.
Evan, it was Governor McCrae.
Wonderful.
Governor
McCrae.
McCrae.
All right.
He went to prison for mail fraud.
I'm going to write down Perfection Fairfax and I will dig this up later.
Okay, I know there's so many more places to see, but we're gonna wrap it up so we can get out of here. Also, we'll have a recording for this so you can
Oh, dear.
share it with your friends
Oh,
and,
no. Posterity.
and knock off some of these on your bucket list. So, but anyway, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to our members of Indiana Landmarks. If you're not a member, we would love to have you join us, and heaven forbid something like the giant paintball be threatened. We will be there to help save that.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you.